A teacher named Cass is sitting on the floor, laying out tarot cards, when suddenly something catches her attention. She sees a crow flying towards her window. The next day, Cass tells her students to enjoy their vacation. After class, a student named Andrew walks with her and asks how she plans to spend her break. Cass replies that she and her husband are renovating their house. After Andrew leaves, John, another teacher, approaches Cass and asks if she'd like to grab a drink with him and some other colleagues. Cass agrees and says she'll meet them at the inn. After having a drink, Cass declines John's offer to give her a ride home. When she gets into her car, she receives a call from her husband, who is tired of waiting for her. Cass tells him he can go to bed and promises she won't drive through the forest. While Cass is on the road, she almost gets hit by a large truck. She then decides to drive through the forest, but she comes across a car in the middle of the road. When she stops, she sees a woman inside the car, but Cass doesn't take any action and decides to head home. The next day, Matthew, Cass's husband, tells her that he heard on the news a woman was found dead near their home. Cass says nothing about the previous night and tells him she's going to take a shower. She watches the news on her phone and wonders if it's the same woman she saw in the car the night before. Later, Cass tells Matthew that she's going to meet her friend Rachel, and when she notices that he doesn't want her to go, Cass says that Rachel is her best friend. Rachel tells Cass that John likes her, but Cass replies that John is already dating someone. Cass then asks Rachel to be more supportive of Matthew, but Rachel responds that her job is to protect Cass, as she's been vulnerable ever since her mother passed away. After Cass asks Rachel how her trip was, Rachel gives her a dish towel as a gift. Cass finds an old photo from her theater days and mentions a recent call from her agent about an audition. Cass briefly considers returning to acting but decides against it because of Matthew, who wants to have a child. A little later, Cass says they need to buy a gift for Susie. Rachel reminds her that they already pooled their money together for the gift and that it was her idea, but Cass doesn't remember any of it. When Cass gets home, she looks toward the road and remembers the night she saw the woman in the car. She then enters her bedroom, and when she looks out the window, she sees someone outside. At that moment, Matthew appears, but when Cass tells him there's someone out there, the person is gone. He tells her she's imagining things, but Cass insists it's not just her imagination. On the day of Susie's party, Rachel tells Cass that during her trip, she found out who the murder victim near the forest was. Her name was Jane, and she worked at the same company as Rachel. Cass immediately recognizes the name and says that she met Jane when Rachel took her to a party, and they even exchanged phone numbers. At Susie's party, Cass notices John, and Susie mentions that he's her tennis coach. Later, when they're about to go to bed, Matthew shows Cass a photo of the victim, and Cass confirms that it is indeed Jane. Cass asks who could have done it, and Matthew replies that it was probably a random murder. This information worries Cass, and she says they should update the house's security system and get a dog as well. When Matthew gets out of bed to check the doors, Cass receives a call, but when she answers, all she hears is static. The next day, Cass watches the news and learns that the police have set up an anonymous tip line for any leads on Jane's murder. As Cass starts to write down the number, she suddenly hears a noise coming from the plastic tarps. She doesn't notice that someone is there, so she locks the door and rushes back to the kitchen to answer the phone, only to hear the same static from the night before. The doorbell rings and Cass lets the security technician in, even though her husband isn't home. But as soon as Cass senses something off about the technician, she asks him to come back when her husband is home. Hours later, Cass goes to the spot where Jane was found, and when she arrives, she sees flowers and notes left in remembrance. She also finds an earring and picks it up. Suddenly, she hears a noise, and when she looks, she sees a fox, which startles her and makes her return to the car. After getting home, Cass realizes that the earring she found actually belongs to her. As night falls, Cass is relaxing in her bathtub, and when she submerges her entire body in the water, she feels as if someone is trying to drown her. But when she comes up for air, she realizes that there's no one around. Startled, Cass calls her husband to inform him that someone is in the house. When he says he'll call the police, Cass just asks him to come home. At that moment, the doorbell rings, and when she opens the door, she finds Detective Lawson there. The police explain to Cass that they are there because someone called and said she was on Blackwater Lane on the day of Jane's murder. Cass is surprised by this information and says she was going to call the tip line but ended up getting nervous. After Matthew arrives, they participate in an interrogation in their home. Cass explains that, besides it being night that day, it was also raining, which is why she couldn't see that it was Jane. She also mentions that she continued driving because it seemed like the person didn't need help. Minutes later, Cass notices the kitchen window is open and states that all the doors and windows were locked while she was in the bathtub. Matthew seems indifferent to what she says and only reprimands her for driving through the forest that night. Cass reveals that she didn't mention it because they would end up arguing. Matthew states that he needs to finish the security installation before his week-long work trip. Cass is surprised as she doesn't remember him mentioning it, but he insists he told her about the trip 3 weeks ago. The next day, Cass calls Rachel, who tells her she can stay at her house. Minutes later, Cass receives the same suspicious call again, and just as she is about to leave, her student Andrew arrives to return the book she lent him. Cass arrives at school where she finds John, who tells her that he used to play tennis with Jane. However, they had to stop because Jane's husband was jealous of their relationship. As they are leaving, Cass asks John if he's still going to take a vacation in Greece, and he reveals that he has broken up with his girlfriend. Later, Rachel calls Cass to let her know that she still can't go to her house because she is with a client. Then Cass sees someone behind the tarp, and in her panic, she gets tangled in the plastic sheets and falls to the ground. Still very shaken, Cass spots the tarot cards and receives another call from an unknown number, which terrifies her and makes her cry. She curls up in her bed. Hours later, Cass hears a chilling voice calling her name in the hallway. When she sees someone coming toward her, she quickly enters a room. Hearing the sound of glass breaking, she calls the police to report that someone is breaking into her house. Hours later, Lawson informs her that they didn't find anyone inside the house, and then a man on the other end of the line reveals that Cass has been admitted to a psychiatric hospital and stayed there for 2 years. Feeling scared to be alone at home, Cass decides to go to a hotel. John has lunch with her, and she tells him that Matthew is still on his work trip. Cass believes that everything happening to her is related to Jane, but she also doubts that it could be Andrew, who she thinks might have feelings for her. After lunch, while they're walking, John tries to kiss Cass, but she refuses. When Matthew returns from his trip, Cass is dressed nicely and waiting for him. He asks if she has been taking her medication since the day her mother died and informs her that those medications can cause hallucinations. Cass asks to see the contract for the security system that she signed, and Matthew tells her that he stopped by the house and the only information he has is that she and the security chief agreed that the installation would be that day. When Cass asks to see the contract, Matthew says he will show it to her later and mentions that they should enjoy the night together. After they become intimate, Matthew falls asleep, and Cass takes the opportunity to look at the contract and her signature. The next morning, while Cass is tending to the plants, her husband mentions that he heard on the news that the murderer used a knife to kill Jane, but Cass asks him to stop talking about it. Moments later, Lawson asks Matthew if he can confirm Cass's story about arriving home at 11:45 that night, but he says he was already asleep. One morning, Cass finds a note on her doorstep from Jane's husband, thanking her for the flowers and expressing a desire to meet her. Cass tells Rachel that she feels insecure and wants to leave the house. She also shares that Matthew thinks she is having hallucinations. That day, Cass visits Jane's husband, Alex, who believes that Jane was having a secret affair with John. However, Cass insists that Jane would never cheat on him because she truly loved her husband. The next day, a baby stroller arrives at Cass's house, and Matthew assumes that she is pregnant, but Cass denies being pregnant and states that she didn't order the stroller. Worried about his wife, Matthew thinks it's time for her to consult Dr. Deakins, the psychiatrist who believes that Cass may be showing early signs of dementia, similar to what her mother experienced before she died. Upon hearing this, Cass appears upset. Meanwhile, Alex talks to Lawson about the conversation he had with Cass. As night falls, Cass is watching TV when she suddenly sees her mother's face and hears a voice calling her name. When she runs to find her husband, she discovers a knife with blood on the kitchen table. After she finds her husband and tells him what she saw, they go to the kitchen, but there's no knife, leaving her even more desperate. The next day, while Cass is lying on the couch, she hears a baby's voice that leads her outside the house. There, she finds a cloth thrown on her lawn, and when she opens it, she is shocked to see a dead crow, which makes her run back inside. Once inside, she experiences flashbacks of the recent events, and then she decides to take some pills. Cass wakes up in a hospital and is informed that she took too many pills, but she insists that she only took 2. Upon returning home, Matthew tells her that he is going out to buy Chinese food. At that moment, the lights begin to flicker, leaving Cass in a panic. Suddenly, the doorbell rings, and when she opens the door, it's Detective Lawson. Cass asks if the detective saw the flickering lights, but he says he did not. Lawson explains that he is there because he received a report that someone said Cass tried to take her own life. Cass replies that she has been taking pills since the day her mother died and that this time she must have taken more than she should have. But Lawson also says that he received another report and asks if Cass has gone back to the place where the crime happened. Cass shows him the earring she found, which she believes belongs to her. When asked why she didn't mention it before, Cass explains that she had no idea what to do. Lawson notes that the neighbors refer to that house as the Crawford house and that Rachel's middle name is Crawford. Cass replies that it's not a coincidence because Rachel's grandfather was involved in a scheme and had to sell everything he owned, including that house. Hours later, Cass reads a letter from her psychiatrist advising her to undergo more tests to ensure that she isn't starting to show signs of dementia. Cass calls the security company she hired to request a copy of the contract with her signature sent to her email. That day, Cass goes to Susie's house and discovers that Rachel had an affair with Jane's best friend Kelly's husband. After Kelly found out about the affair, it led her to end the relationship. Upon returning home, a black car crashes into Cass's car. When she reports the incident to the police, her husband mentions that the dents on her car were from the previous week and that Cass probably forgot because her memory has been failing in recent weeks. However, she refuses to accept that she is developing dementia. Cass then receives a call from the security company, informing her that they received the wrong contract the day before because she had been sent a second contract. When the woman mentions the installation date, Cass finds it strange because she is sure she was still at the hotel that day. Cass meets Rachel for lunch and shares how Matthew is treating her, making her believe that her husband is cheating on her. Rachel then says she will send the contact information of a private investigator she knows. Cass asks if Rachel has ever had a case with anyone, but Rachel gives a vague response. When Rachel steps out to go to the bathroom, Cass hears a phone ringing from Rachel's bag and decides to look. Cass reads the messages and discovers that Rachel and Matthew are having an affair and that they killed Jane because Jane once saw the two of them together in the office. Moments later, Cass finds the knife wrapped in the dish towel that Rachel gave her. Disappointed and tormented by the entire situation, Cass takes several pills and uses the knife to hurt herself. A few minutes later, Andrew goes to his teacher's house, but when she doesn't answer, he decides to look through the window and finds Cass lying on the sofa, injured. Andrew calls the police, who quickly inform Matthew about the tragic event. When Cass's husband arrives, he is informed by Andrew that Cass did not survive. Hours later, Rachel and Matthew decide to search for the phone containing the evidence of the crime, and suddenly they see an image of Cass with blood behind the plastic tarp. Rachel hears someone fleeing and goes after them. At that moment, John appears and attacks Matthew, but Rachel quickly shows up and strikes John on the head. Outside, Rachel and Matthew chase after Cass, who is still alive. Cass gets into a struggle with Rachel, who pushes her head underwater, but Matthew soon appears and strikes Cass. After Cass regains consciousness, Rachel taunts her, claiming she is having an affair with John and provoking her by saying she is suffering from dementia. Rachel mentions that Cass chose to live in the family house to humiliate her, but Cass counters that her mother financially helped Rachel's family, choosing not to speak up because she didn't want Rachel to feel ashamed. When Cass stands up to confront Rachel, the woman lunges at her with a knife but accidentally stabs Matthew, who jumps in front of Cass. The police arrive, and Lawson reveals that she contacted the university where both women graduated and discovered that Rachel knew Cass's husband long before they got married. Days later, Cass recounts everything that happened to Alex. John has recovered from his injuries, but Matthew has died. Rachel admits that once she realized Cass was struggling with the death of her mother, she and Matthew concocted a plan to make it seem like Cass was beginning to develop dementia. On the day Jane caught Rachel and Matthew having an affair, Rachel killed Jane and planted evidence to frame Cass as the prime suspect in the murder. Everything that Cass experienced was orchestrated by the two of them. Cass reveals that when she discovered a hidden camera in her home, she decided to call John, Lawson, and Andrew because she knew that Rachel and Matthew were spying on her and would try to retrieve the knife and the phone. To mislead them, she used fake blood to stage a suicide attempt. Even after everything, Cass finds herself missing Rachel and Matthew, despite knowing that they never truly loved her. This experience ultimately leads her to realize that she is stronger than she ever thought possible. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to check out one of these videos that are popping up on your screen. Thank you for watching.